Hi guys, hold on for a second. Before we proceed to the video, I have something very important to tell you. Professor Jon V Kofas has published his new book in collaboration with Little French Media, and the title of the book is Neoliberalism, Inequality, and Authoritarianism. This book details how neoliberalism impacts the geopolitical economy in the 21st century. You can buy it from Amazon and the link is in the description. Thank you. Now let's proceed to the video.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. The idea here is to introduce a video, a much longer video, which is called Twilight of the West, namely the decline of the transatlantic powers, Northwest Europe, United States, Canada, and the transition in the 21st century from the transatlantic powers as the core of the capitalist world economy to East Asia. Let's face it, according to the IMF and the World Bank, according to Goldman Sachs, according to anyone's measure you want to take, the number one economy in the world in terms of purchasing power parity is China by well over 7 trillion, beyond what the United States has in GDP, 28 for the US, roughly 35, a bit over 35 for China. And the transition of the core of the world economy from the US to China and the China-led group versus the US-led G7 has been a topic of enormous analysis, books, articles, videos, what have you. There is no shortage of analysis on this issue. There is a shortage of good, sound analysis in terms of analysis that is as free of hyperbole, by the way, of idle rhetoric as possible. I have done two videos basically on this issue. Actually, I've done more than that, but on this particular issue on the Twilight with a title too, which basically the idea is to see what gave rise to the West and then what accounts for the decline of the West. One of the inspirations for the decline of the West, of course, comes from the great German scholar Oswald Spengler, The Decline of the West. After the title of the book, after the First World War was over and he was rather pessimistic. Of course, the West to him was Western Europe. Anyway, that was just the beginning. Let's look at what accounted for the rise of the West before we look at the decline. The rise of the West really starts with the Renaissance, roughly in the 14th century, coincides more or less with the Black Death in the 14th century. And then the scientific revolution in the 17th century. So we go from the Renaissance. The Renaissance actually opens up the mind of the Europeans to education. This is the genesis of higher education. There was no higher education. Schools, education was an extension of the church, by the way. Secular education comes with the Renaissance. Okay? The Renaissance is the opening of the European mind. As a result of cultural diffusion, the Europeans learned a lot by going outside of the continent into Africa and especially into Asia, by the way, especially into Asia, and learned a lot from China. And they learned a lot from the Byzantium as well. Okay, the Byzantine Empire. And the age of science is a continuation of that, with the questioning of religious assumptions about scientific matters, everything from the universe, um, the idea of a geocentric universe, which was, of course, a religious idea, to Newtonian physics, um, as and to rely on empirical evidence for knowledge. Empiricism became very important. Empirical evidence as a source of knowledge, and mathematics, by the way. The Enlightenment era of the 18th century further contributed to the rise of Europe. However, there is a however here. During the Renaissance, scientific revolution, and the Enlightenment period of the 18th century, in other words, coinciding with all of this, was something else that the Europeans did. They began an outward expansion, looking into the rest of the world, and began to conquer, colonize. And that, without that, just having Renaissance, scientific revolution, and enlightenment was not the catalyst. It would not have done anything. They needed the cheap raw materials and labor from Latin America, which they colonized, by the way, Africa, which they began colonizing after the Portuguese were the first in the 15th century to land in Northwest Africa, and then Asia. Okay, so the transatlantic slave trade of especially the 18th century, the age of the Enlightenment, was key, because the slaves in the New World, in the Western Hemisphere, were producing abundant raw materials at very cheap prices that made the Industrial Revolution of England possible. So what we have here is the one country in the world, namely England, becoming the first industrialized country on the planet. And industrialization and technology was applied to defense, to the military sector, and that made them even more powerful. England becomes the number one navy in the world, number one military power in the world. So these are interrelated. This is how the West rises, with Northwest Europe, England being the core of the world economy until it was challenged in the late 19th century by Northwest Europe, United States, Japan. Okay, and then there is the explosion of World War I because of that challenge emanating from Germany, Imperial Germany, by the way. So we have the rise of the West, but then we have the decline of the West because of the competition, the imperialist competition of the countries themselves, as the great English scholar John Hobson wrote in his book entitled Imperialism, a two-volume work in 1902, who presaged, by the way the Europeans were going, there would be a global war, and it would mean destruction on a mass scale and the decline of Europe. And that's exactly what happened. So by 1918, 1919, when the book is published, when Oswald Spengler, the German scholar, publishes his book, The Decline of the West, there you have it. You have the disillusionment of the Europeans that the rationalist foundations of Western civilization have collapsed. Then there's the Great Depression in the 1930s, further disillusioning the West, followed by World War II. Now, out of the ashes of World War II emerges Pax Americana. The United States is the superpower of the Western world. unchallenged except by the Soviet Union, which had nuclear weapons after 1949, by the way. And then, of course, 1949 being the same year that Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai in China prevailed over Chiang Kai-shek in the Chinese Revolution. So they take over China. China becomes communist. And there is a division, the so-called East-West confrontation division in the world. But the West prevailed. The West prevailed in the post-war period throughout the Cold War. And the West presumably won the war, the Cold War, rather, just as it won World War II. It did not actually. China won the Cold War because the emerging superpower of the Cold War after the post Cold War era was not the United States, it was China. By the 1990s, the late 1990s, and certainly by 2000, 2001, when China has arrived as the emerging industrialized power of the planet, the factory of the world, and it achieves most favored nation status, joins the World Trade Organization. China is beginning to lay the foundations for its global ascendancy, which necessarily means the decline of the West. It's a transition. I don't see it as a decline. The pessimists do, by the way. I see a transition. The United States isn't going to become Ecuador or some, or Namibia, is some very minor global South country. It's not like that. It is going to be in a lesser role than it has been economically on a world scale. Hence, the reliance of the West on geopolitical, that is, military means to keep its status as it was back in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, which is impossible because society history is moving very rapidly. China is the undisputed economic power of the world by anyone's measure, by the way. The decline of the West is a project that I invite you to take a look at, write comments, and I also would ask you to join this educational channel, which my very good friend Asad Alim manages. Thank you for watching. Thank you very much.